All right, today's lecture is going to cover the fall of the Roman Republic. Last century and a half of Rome as a republic, at least technically. They'll call themselves a republic for the 5 centuries, but we'll see how Rome goes from being a republic to being an autocracy. The idea of the 12 tables is the foundation of law in the Roman Republic. Roman society, education, philosophy, the idea of the paterfamilias, the idea of slavery in the Roman Republic, particularly the idea of the Spartacus and the slave rebellion, the latifundia, the forms of Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus, a couple of later consuls, Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the first triumvirate means ruled by 3, Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, Marcus Brutus, the second triumvirate, Octavian Caesar, Mark Antony, Lepidus, battles of Philippi and Actium. We start off with this principle, fiat justitia ruat caelum. This is an ancient Roman legal theory dating back to the Republic. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Translated means, let justice be done though the heavens fall. It's that central idea of the Republic that all men were to be treated equally under the law, no matter what the consequences. Everyone equal though the heavens fall. This principle that guided the Roman Republic and Roman society for many years. Remember, Romans, above all else, did value the idea of stability. So they were traditional people. No matter what else you may think of the Romans, no matter what else they did that may be very different from our society, somewhat sort of be not very nice behavior in improper society, improper behavior in our society, but they were somewhat traditional people. Now, the 12 tables was a law system dating back to 450 BC. 12 tables governed things such as debt, rights of the head of the family, guardianship, succession, public law, and so forth. It essentially tried to get to, like any other law system, tried to canonize and make clear what values the Roman society tried to keep intact, tried to emphasize above all else. Particularly ideas about property, about the rights of the head of the family, and so forth. Here in the book on page 119, you see such examples here as the 3rd table, execution law of debt. When a debt has been acknowledged or judgment about the matter has been pronounced in court, 30 days must be the legitimate time of grace. After that, the debtor may be arrested by laying on of hands. Bring him into court. If he does not satisfy the judgment, or no one in court offers himself as surety in his behalf, the creditor may take the defaulter with him. They bind him either in stocks or in fetters. Unless they make a settlement, debtors should be held in a bond for 60 days. During that time, they should be brought before the praetor's court at the meeting place for 3 successive market days. The amount for which they are judged liable shall be announced. On the 3rd market day, they shall suffer capital punishment or be delivered up across the sill for fraud across the Tiber. 450 BC, the Tiber was the traditional edge of town, but long after that, the city of Rome itself would encompass both sides of the Tiber. Essentially, you see here a radical shift from what we see in modern American society of the 21st century versus Roman law. If you found yourself in debt, modern American law, you can declare bankruptcy, try to reorganize your debts. But in Roman law, if you were unable to come up with some kind of terms for meeting a debt, you could be executed or sold into slavery, unless someone offered themselves as a bond and on your behalf. Now, you'd be in a lot of trouble. Table 4 While the Romans admired the many achievements of the Greeks, socially they were perhaps closer to the Spartans than the other, probably closer to the true inheritors of Spartan ideas about the military. Because in Roman society, this time period, they're a family-oriented society like any other society. Romans had little tolerance for weakness. Not a society that showed mercy easily. So Christianity emerges in the 1st century AD beyond the ideas of mercy, brotherhood, peace, compassion were somewhat unfamiliar to traditional Roman ideas. Christianity says, embrace the weak, help the weak. The Romans have a little patience for it. For example, here, writes the head of the family, quickly kill a dreadfully deformed child. The Romans would practice infanticide. They would not spend resources on a child that was had significant health disabilities at the beginning of his life. Whereas today, we would do absolutely everything possible to make such a child comfortable, do whatever can that child live a comfortable and normal life. Disobedient children could be sold into slavery. 5-year-old man was tough. If a father 3 times surrenders a son for sale, the son shall be freed from his father. You can only sell your son into slavery 3 times. And of course, about minutes of into the wills and estates. A child born 10 months after the father's death will not be admitted into legal inheritance. You can see how there's a problem there. If it's more than 10 months after the father's dead, then that probably ain't the daddy. Guardianship and succession in a male-oriented society. Females remain in guardianship even when they have attained their majority. When they become adults, women were still supposed to have some kind of male guardian looking after their interests. If a man is raving mad, rightful authority over his person shall belong to his agnates, that is, nearest male relatives, or to his clansmen. Spendthrift is forbidden to exercise administration of his own goods. A person who, being insane or spendthrift, is prohibited from administering his own goods, but shall be under trusteeship of agnates. Table 8, torts or dialects. If any person has sung or composed against another person songs such as calling slander or insult to another, he shall be clubbed to death. So Romans had a great sense of humor, but you might see on modern TV shows like Saturday Night Live or parody newspapers like The Onion, Roman law wouldn't tolerate that very much. If a person has maimed another's limb, let there be retaliation in kind unless he makes agreement for settlement with him. It is eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Any person who destroys by burning any building or heap of corn deposited alongside a house shall be bound, scourged, and put to death by burning with a stake. An eye for an eye. Provided he has committed said with misdeed with malice aforethought, but it was committed by accident, but by negligence, so ordained that he repair the damage, or be too poor and competent to such punishment, or receive a lighter chastisement. That is, if it's an accident, so far out of control something, then some other arrangements can be made. Public law, the Romans had no tolerance for corruption, at least in legal theory and legal practice. When it came to light, the Romans were pretty disgusted by it, but unfortunately for the Romans, which became a problem for them, was it became more and more a fact of life in the latter republic and many periods of the empire. Table 9. The penalty shall be a capital punishment for a judge or arbiter legally appointed who has been found guilty of receiving a bribe or giving a decision. As those on the take are to be executed. Now, Romans contact with Greece were totally fascinated by them. Now, the Greeks had a contact with the Romans for a long period of time. As Rome grew and developed and increased its influence in the Italian peninsula. But as the Romans moved into Greece itself, about the 2nd century BC, the Romans were totally captivated by the Greeks. Some of the ideas the Greeks had about art, religion, philosophy, science, the Romans found very useful, totally fascinated by it, and could not get enough of it. That's why so often this period is referred to as Greco-Roman. It is not just the Romans, it is also the influences of Greek culture. Maybe centuries past the height of a classical Greek culture, but these thinkers from ancient Greece are having an impact centuries later. Their ideas carried by truth of fact, of numbers, truth of philosophy, even though carried by the strength of Roman armies, is kept intact for centuries. It becomes an indelible part of European culture. Well, as the Romans took over Greek lands, Romans shipped Greek manuscripts and artworks back home. Multitudes of educated Greek slaves were used in Roman households. Virtually every area of Roman life, from literature and philosophy to religion and education, is affected by Greek models. Understand here, being taken as slaves. Unlike what happened in the American South with the Civil War, where slaves were not allowed to be educated, Romans had Greeks brought in as tutors to educate their slaves, even to educate their children, even though the Greek tutors would be slaves. Roman poet Horace said about this development that captive Greece took captive her rude conqueror. Captive Greece took captive her rude conqueror, that is. While Greece may have lost battles, the Greeks won the hearts and minds of the Romans. Like so many societies, Roman religion played a tremendous influence on society. As it came more and more contact with Greeks, its religion too became infused with Greek ideals. Roman religion was polytheistic. That is, had gods ascribed to different aspects of human nature, or different aspects of nature itself. And those gods were slowly rearranged to take it to be in order with the Greek gods. For example, you have the king of the Greek god, Zeus, the Roman king of the Roman gods, Jupiter. Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite. Roman goddess of love, Venus. You can see the planets taken Roman names of Roman gods. Poseidon, the Greek god of the underworld. Neptune, the Roman god of the underworld. So on and so forth. Numerous other examples. But in Roman religion, Romans believed that human beings were totally dependent on the gods. And the Romans could have a relationship with these gods, but only if they performed these rituals exactly. Certain prayers, incantations, rituals had to form just right to win the favor of these different gods. Gods for luck, for good fortune, for love, whatever else. So the Romans had many religious festivals, and the job of the aediles, part of their job was to ensure the grain supply, but also part of the games they had organized, the public festivals, would be religious religious festivals. Now, typically the two kinds of religious private festivals. Public festival ordained and paid for by the state, and these can last for several days on end, honor various Greek gods, Roman gods, to celebrate victories of the military or ask for good fortune for the harvest, things like that. And also private festivals that be celebrated by individuals and families, looking for good fortune, say business or love or childbirth, something like that. By the mid-2nd century BC, 6 public festivals are celebrated annually, each lasting several days. The practice of holding games also grew out of religious festivals. But we also see here is the growth of slavery during the middle years of the Roman Republic. Now, slavery is practiced by many civilizations throughout ancient history. The Romans were no exception. But the Romans began adding slaves on top of slaves, on top of slaves, on top of slaves. Slaves were considered to be a valuable commodity, and so Romans put more capital into gaining slaves, trading slaves. For example, by the 3rd century BC, a small Roman farmer with just 1 or 2 slaves helped those few acres perform domestic chores. Like slaves might be, for some places in Italy, be regarded as much part of the family household. And they have these very rich households that have very large numbers of slaves. But as the Romans took conquest of the Mediterranean, the civilian populations they took control of, these soldiers often took large numbers of slaves. And as these slaves are sold to the general Roman public, in many cases, these fortunes are transferred to the Roman treasuries. And as generals did this, they came to be very, very popular for doing that. Which, of course, created a whole new set of problems. The jobs that a common laborer might find himself having to compete with larger and larger numbers of slaves, making it more difficult for a common laborer in Rome, a free man, to make a living for his family. And also, the number one overriding problem of every slaveholding society in history, which is, what if they do to us what we did to them? The idea, what if they rebel? It's human nature for human beings to detest captivity. We don't like being held against our will. It's actually the idea of all these slaves being held by the Romans. Now, the children of slaves, they become slaves, and their children become slaves as well, unless their owners decide to free them. And that would happen every so often. But not very often, because this is simply too valuable for many of them to simply have slaves, keep trading them back and forth. But as we get into the 2nd century BC, so much of these Roman buildings, architecture such as the roads, the aqueducts that transport water hundreds of miles from mountains to plains, all this labor is being done by slave labor. Those were masterful architects and engineers, but they had slaves doing all the dirty work for them. Not only the buildings, you might see, classical Greek arches and architecture, names on them basically saying who built them, basically who put up the money for them. Julius Caesar, Pompey, Marcus Cicero, whoever else. But it was the slaves who did all the work. But it's difficult to judge just how much of the population was held in slavery. Some estimates are maybe 20 to 30% of the population, maybe even higher. How they're treated very widely. Some were treated very kindly, physically very well. Others were brutalized. It's not against the law for a Roman to murder his own slaves. That did happen often. Roman Republic had strict laws against aiding runaway slaves and how slaves should be treated. The murder of a slave owner by one slave in the household might mean that the entire household of slaves is to be executed. All of them. In the 2nd century BC, you have large-scale slave revolts occurring in southern Italy and Sicily, where you have large concentrations of slavery. And particularly, society here, a lot of Fundia. A lot of Fundia is a large estate. The nobles and the aristocrats start gaining control of these large estates, taking over small farms, taking over newly conquered lands, expanding these estates larger and larger, having armies of slaves to take care of them. But having all these slaves was very difficult to control. So what they typically do is that slaves would be branded, work in chains, usually housed at night in underground prisons, so they cannot escape. In many cases, they are beaten and inadequately fed. Several horrible slave revolts did erupt. 139 to 132 BC. This horrible first slave revolt in Sicily. Tens of thousands of slaves took the Roman army 7 years to suppress. Second one from 104 to 100 BC. Again, involved in the second slave revolt in Sicily. Of all the slaves up in arms across most of the island, took the Roman army of 17,000 to suppress, and tens of thousands of slaves up in arms. So there are many other examples. But perhaps the most famous of these revolts was 73 to 71 BC, southern Italy. It's the rebellion of Spartacus. Spartacus had been a gladiator of Thrace. It is the area in the southeastern Europe, just kind of just right on the northern end of the Aegean Sea. Well, the Romans were increasingly enjoying gladiatorial games. Basically, these fights to the death. They're fighting with swords or whatever else they could find, their bare hands, and they'd often have to fight till one was dead. Gladiators were usually slaves. But to start getting into like the 1st and 2nd century AD, sometimes start seeing some free individuals as slaves, simply caught up in the popularity of the whole thing. But typically, slaves. Sometimes slaves could fight for the freedom. Sometimes they couldn't. That's where we're getting the thumbs up and thumbs down from. If one gladiator had another on the ground, and the crowd wanted the one on the ground to be finished off, they made kind of a stabbing motion downward, thumbs down, finish him off. But if they liked the way the other slave fought, there's life in general, they not necessarily thumbs up, but they make kind of a closed motion with their fingers over their thumb, like a dagger being sheathed. That's where we get the thumbs up, thumbs down idea from. the thumbs up being generally a sign of approval, but wasn't one that the Romans necessarily used. The flipping someone off, giving the middle finger, that was a Roman gesture. It meant exactly the same thing that it does in modern America. It's usually a gesture shown by Roman soldiers against their enemies before the beginning of a battle. Spartacus is a very famous gladiator, famed for his prowess and victories in the gladiatorial arena. Decided one day that enough was enough. Organized his fellow slaves into rebellion of tens of thousands of slaves against the Roman army. And they're quite good. They won several battles against several Roman armies. They always seemed to be, for several years, they seemed to stay just a step ahead of the Romans. Withering away resistance, steadily gaining allies. At one point, it seemed to be almost unstoppable. But in 71 BC, he was trapped, and he and 6,000 of his followers were crucified. Bodies hung along the Appian Way, as a warning to any other future slave that may threaten to rise up. Crucifixion was the most brutal form of punishment the Romans could think of. They would be hanged for days on these wooden crosses until they died. Often, sometimes from bleeding death, sometimes heart attack or stroke, sometimes exposure. But the end is always the same, a horrible, unpleasant death. Now, Romans in general said they preferred order. Romans governed by the idea in their family as paterfamilias. Paterfamilias, which means father-centered family. It is in Roman society, the head of the household, the father, was the center of the family's universe. The father's word was unquestioned. Also do whatever he wanted in that household, without a question. His fathers would arrange for marriages of daughters. Mothers sometimes have influence of the choice, but usually the father having the final say. Roman Republic women married what's called cum manu, which means with legal control. Translated from Latin. Basically transferring legal control of daughters from the father to the husband. But towards the end of the 1st century BC, though, the sine manu system got adopted without legal control. It meant that married daughters especially remained within the father's legal power, but the father sometimes didn't necessarily have control of who their daughter had married. In many cases, marriages are arranged more for political expediency and for business reasons, property reasons, other than just what the father said. And traditionally, Roman marriages are intended for life, but divorce is introduced in the 3rd century BC and became relatively easy to obtain since either party in Roman law could initiate it. Wanting to prove the breakdown of marriage. Basically, just would call in American society no-fault divorce. Basically, anybody initiating dissolution of the marriage for any reason. Now, divorce became especially prevalent in the 1st century BC, period of political turmoil. Increasingly have these sine manu marriages. Daughters deciding they want to marry up for someone else. Marry someone else for their own political or financial reasons, or their fathers still may insist they divorce their husband because they found someone better for them. Breaking up a perfectly good marriage because the father decided they found someone better, or at least better for the father's purposes. Now, some parents in upper-class marriages provide an education for the daughters. Some girls have private tutors and maybe have gone to primary schools or the Roman equivalent of it. Actually, young boys, they'd be attending school regularly, at least the Roman equivalent of it. But when boys be entering secondary schools in the American modern system, girls being pushed into marriage. Now, legally, the minimum was 12 years old, but 14 was a more common age in practice. And the Roman doctors warned that pregnancies at a young age could cause serious health consequences. A lot of these young Roman girls are pushed into marrying and having children at young ages. The problem being that at those ages, Roman girls simply did not have the physical maturity to be able to bear children healthily, and it had a tremendous impact on their health. A lot of young women dying in childbirth or dying at young ages. So the book gives an example of Tullia, which was a daughter of Cicero, who was a one-time Roman consul and a renowned orator, considered to be perhaps one of the greatest orators, speakers of the late Roman Republic. Spoke on a variety of philosophical and legal issues. Well, Cicero had his daughter Tullia married to her first husband at 16. But she was married to a much older man, and she is widowed at the age of 21. Well, she remarries at about the age of 22, 23, a year later. Divorced at 28. Remarried 1 year later at 29, and then divorced at 33. Then died at 34. 34 years old, 3 marriages, 2 divorces, married another one. That was not unusual for a lot of women in Roman society at that time period. Life expectancy is very low. Now, overall, this paterfamilias idea and all these other ideas comes down to another principle in Roman culture, that is mos maiorum, which means concerning the customs or traditions of their ancestors. That is, the Romans like keeping traditions intact. Actually, we think conservative, we think uptight and rigid and very concerned with decorum. It's not necessarily how the Romans saw it, just simply got in mos maiorum, that is, the social order should be kept intact. And for Romans of mos maiorum, the highest principle was called pietas, faith, fidelity. The execution of one's obligations to one's fellow citizens, to the gods, to the state. Fidelity to the state, gods, and family. When we get to the late 2nd century BC, start noticing very serious problem developing in the Roman Republic. Between 233 and 133 BC, 80% of the consuls came from just 26 families. had 2 consuls this time period, 100 years, 160 consuls, only 26 families. This power is being concentrated into smaller and smaller groups of hands. All upper class, all groups determined to maintain control over Rome. Intermarrying back and forth. These consuls may have different styles, different personalities, but they're all about keeping the same group in control. We go even further, the same time period, 50% of consuls, 100 of them, came from only 10 families. A system where technically everyone was eligible, a small group were actually exerting any kind of control at all. So what ends up happening is the nobility in Roman society is starting to notice this and starting to scramble for control over all of Rome. So Roman control is starting to break down into 2 groups among the aristocracy. The optimates is fairly ruled by the best men. That is in Europe. The aristocracy is they know the upper classes are in control, have no problems with that, and want to continue and expand on that. And then the populares, which means favor the people. The populares, they aren't necessarily as altruistic as you think. They favor the input of the people, but they recognize the Republican principle that is a small R Republican. That is, it's the people who control Roman politics technically and legally. But by showing enough favor to the people, it keeps the people satisfied, the great masses of the Roman public, but also keep not only the Roman public satisfied, but if one person can sway the opinions of them, give favors to the Roman public, give them what they want, that can increase their power. That is, these nobles, these populares, favor the people, but not necessarily for altruistic reasons. Not necessarily because they believe in the idea of the republic, but simply as a means to the end. That is more power for themselves. And we talked about a lot of funding, these large estates. What's happening is you're having more and more of these large estates dotting the Italian countryside. While Roman control is expanding over many areas, the latifundia are taking up more and more of the small farms. That is, the farms that the average Roman worked, farmed, and owned. Those are disappearing. That's becoming more and more a problem because, for one thing, where are these farmers going to go? They go to the cities looking for work, but since so much of the menial work is taken up by slaves, there's little work to be had. So you have this large mass of growing mass of Romans who are poor, even homeless. Second, who's in the Roman army at this point? Landowners. The Romans used only landowners in their army. So these landowners would have a vested interest in the success and the victories of the Roman army. If the Roman army loses, it is the landowner who's going to watch those foreign armies coming in and trying to invade their farms. But with fewer and fewer of these Roman farmers available, called the equestrian class, horseman class, with fewer and fewer of these men available, the Roman armies can start having manpower problems. Not enough people populate it. So recognizing that, 133 BC, this man comes along, Tiberius Gracchus. He's a tribune. Basically, he's passing, has the power to pass bills, and his bill is what they call a land reform bill. He's proposing taking Roman monies to buy up some of these large latifundias, these large estates owned by the upper classes, buying them, and then giving these lands to the poor. So giving them fair market value from them, but buying them up and giving them to the poor. Now, Tiberius Gracchus recognized that the underlying cause of Rome's problems was the decline of the small farmer. So he bypassed the Senate, renewed the nobilities would be against this, the nobles, and had his council the pleb to pass this land reform bill to authorize this reclamation bill. So a group of Roman senators, furious at what Tiberius Gracchus had done, they went from the Senate, marched from the Senate to Tiberius Gracchus' home, stabbed him to death, assassinating the sitting tribune. So Tiberius Gracchus is dead. Well, then comes his brother, Gaius Gracchus. He's tribune for 123 and 122 BC. And he, like his brother, recognized the problem that Rome was facing, the decline of the small farmer. Recognized the necessity of the Roman farmers having a control over, having a large number of Roman farmers. So he tries a similar bill, but this time opens it up to not just the landless Romans, but the middle classes as well. The bill passes. Even more popular than before, but senators hostile to Gaius Gracchus' popularity of this land reform bill basically hired a mob to go to Gaius Gracchus' office and have him torn limb from limb. So he too is killed. Then comes Marius. He's made consul in 107 BC. Comes to power at a time when Rome was struggling to put down a rebellion in its provinces, wins the election on a platform of let's win the war. Took command of the army in Africa, brought the war to a successful conclusion, then called on to speak to the Celts, who were Celts, depending on pronunciation, threatened an invasion of Italy. Very successful military commander. What happens is something unprecedented after this. He's made consul. It's supposed to be just a one-year term from 104 to 100 BC. So it's time Rome was facing this slave rebellion in Sicily. Well, they're facing uprisings of slaves. They're facing invasion by the Celts. So Marius raises a new army, finally defeats the Celts, leaving position of a personal political ascendancy in Rome. But he did two things to raise this army. Since there were so few landed Romans available, he recruited volunteers from the landless, the poor living in the city and the countrysides, and had these volunteers who were an oath of loyalty, not to Rome, not to the Roman state, but to Marius himself. Effective commander, but he changed the way the rules are being played. Now, it's not unusual for Roman consuls to have more than 1 year term. If they're really good, they have a lot of military power behind them. And now you have men with enough power and enough wealth, they can raise armies all on their own. Then, Lucius Cornelius Sulla comes along. Well, the Senate placed him in charge of the war in Asia Minor. The council of plebs tried to transfer command of this war to Marius, who's still around. He's retired, but they liked Marius better. Marius liked this idea of coming back to power and taking command of an army again. Civil war erupted. Sulla 1 sees Rome itself in 82 BC. Instead of giving him the title of consul, Sulla takes the title of dictator. Reaching back some ways in the history of the Roman Republic, remember, a dictator. Someone brought in to basically seize control, seize power, seize control, and to basically, traditionally, to solve problems, but only for a short period of time. The Senate gives him the title of dictator to reconstitute the republic, as Sulla says, wipes out all of his opposition, restores the power of the Senate, and eliminates most of the power of the popular assemblies, the tribunes, and the plebs. In 79 BC, 3 years later, convinced he had done all this, quietly steps into retirement. What he's done, though, is prove that a man with that kind of power, raise an army, can take control of Rome anytime he wants to. The Republic is not restored. Power is just being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Precedents are being set for men to seize power on their own. Well, by 60 BC, power is so concentrated to the point that basically 3 men get together and divide power among Rome for themselves. Those are Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, the first triumvirate. Something about these men. Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, his wealth gained basically from the slave trade. He had successfully put down the major slave rebellion led by Spartacus in 71 BC. Pompey, returned from a successful military command in Spain, had been hailed as a military hero, put down a series of rebellions and strengthened Roman control in the Iberian Peninsula. And Julius Caesar, remember the upper classes, but one of the populares, takes control. And essentially, they made a deal to consolidate control among all 3. But this way, though, means one cannot try to outmaneuver, try to do another. They cannot do anything without support of 2. So power is relatively balanced because one might be against another, but the second is usually not going to go against the other 2. So they put together the aims they wanted. Pompey received land for his veterans and commanded Spain. Crassus given a command in Syria and dreamed of conquering what had been the Seleucid dynasty. And Julius Caesar is granted a special military command in Gaul, that's modern-day France. It's here that Julius Caesar went into won control of Gaul for Rome. Wrote it later in his, he wrote a book later, said, good famous statement, Veni, Veni, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. And Julius Caesar gained even more wealth and prestige from his adventures in Gaul because he seized a bunch of slaves and gave the proceeds to the Roman treasury. Well, Crassus, though, is killed in 53 BC in battle. Got a little bit of rank land for Rome, but not much. So Pompey and Julius Caesar now are at odds with each other. Well, say the choice between the 2, the Senate decided they wanted Pompey instead of Julius Caesar. Thought Pompey is more malleable and easier to control than Caesar. So the Senate, deciding to end the situation, tells Julius Caesar to put down his command and return quietly to Rome. Julius Caesar refuses to do so. Keeps his army intact, marches into Italy, crossing the Rubicon illegally. Basically, the term crossing the Rubicon means crossing the point of no return. Julius Caesar declared his intentions, that is, he was coming to fight Pompey in the Senate if necessary. Caesar marched on Rome, starting a civil war between forces of those Pompey and his allies. Pompey is overwhelmingly defeated, leaving Julius Caesar to complete control of the government. So at this point, 47 BC, Caesar is made dictator. In 44 BC, made dictator for life. And Julius Caesar continued to hold elections for offices, but he saw to it that supporters chose people he recommended. He did a number of ambitious reforms, increasing the Senate to 900 from 300, filling with many supporters, granting citizenship to a number of people in the provinces that helped establish colonies of Roman citizens in North Africa, Gaul, and Spain, and therefore by Romanizing those areas much more quickly. Reorganized some administrative structures in the cities. In a visit to Egypt, he fell in love, had this torrid affair with Queen Cleopatra VII. Two ended up having a son together named Caesarion. But Julius Caesar, though, was the kind of man, well, he's notorious for having affairs with basically pretty much anybody, women and men alike. So it's well known in Roman society, but the nature of Roman society, the Romans really didn't care very much. But interestingly enough, Julius Caesar brought an Egyptian reform to Rome, that is, the calendar, and called the Julian calendar, crude basis of the modern calendar we use in the West today. Introduced the Egyptian solar year of 365 days. But he modified slightly in 1582, the Gregorian calendar, but the Julian calendar is basically the foundation of our modern calendar. Months and so forth, the way the months are named and so forth. They planned many more adventures in the way of building projects and adventures in the East, but 44 BC, a group of leading senators upset with him, fearing his increasing power, decided to assassinate him. So a conspiracy led by Marcus Brutus. Brutus led a group of senators to march up to Caesar while he presided over the Senate, and they all stabbed him to death over and over again, claiming to be a sacrifice to Rome that would not have a king. Caesar would never declare himself a king, but he declared himself dictator for life, just maintained the appearance of a republic, but just for appearances. The fact was, the power was his for the rest of his life. He wanted to do it, he had no intentions of giving it up. So what ends up happening, though, is, so our image of this death, though, is this assassination of Caesar, the events afterward, is a popular imagination probably closest to William Shakespeare's tragedy of Julius Caesar. So Caesar's dying words, Brutus et tu, Brute, which Latin means and you, Brutus. Likely what he actually probably said was, and you, my son. You see, growing up, Julius Caesar was a common guest in the Brutus household. See, Marcus Brutus's mother and Julius Caesar had an affair for several years. So Marcus Brutus and Julius Caesar knew each other very well. But Brutus decided that Julius Caesar needed to die. So what ends up happening after this is a second triumph quickly forms of Caesar surviving out. It forces loyal to the Senate line up against the second triumvirate and launch into a massive civil war. Second triumvirate included Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian Caesar, at 18 at this point. Mark Antony had been his lieutenant and right-hand man. And Lepidus, who had been basically a very wealthy man in Rome, man of some influence, but eventually Lepidus is pushed off to the side. And eventually comes control of Octavian and Mark Antony. Well, the senatorial force has defeated a number of battles. finally being defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Here at this point, Marcus Brutus decides to commit suicide rather than avoid capture by the forces of the triumvirate. So control of Rome falls to Octavian and Mark Antony. Mark Antony, like Julius Caesar, planning military campaigns in the east, perhaps to take over Parthia, but at that point was Persia. But stops in Egypt, where he too has an affair with Cleopatra. Cleopatra is one of these old Greek Ptolemaic rulers, or she and her half-brother Ptolemy XIII. Her half-brother had been forced to marry. He was like 10 years old, she was like 20-something. Cleopatra had him killed. Basically, just a woman who forced her way up to the top of the power. Was careful to make close allies with Rome, knowing the increasing influence and strength they had in the region. Well, like the Julius Caesar, she and Mark Antony fell in love, had this torrid affair that scandalized Rome. It's kind of hard to scandalize Rome, but they managed to do it, and Octavian Caesar managed to make sure that Rome was totally scandalized by it. That here Mark Antony, this one-time proud patriot of Rome, was seduced by this horrible, awful woman, Cleopatra, while Mark Antony is trying to lead Roman forces to glory and victory in the east, while Mark Antony's wife is sitting at home in Rome. Remember, Mos Maiorum. There was a double standard here, but Octavian wanted to take advantage of that. Octavian is able to do something Pompey was not. He has the military mind like Julius Caesar, but he's able to get control of Roman public opinion. Pompey getting control of the influence of the upper classes, but also the Roman public in general. So what he ends up doing is, the closer Mark Antony gets to Cleopatra, one way or another, Octavian Caesar makes it a matter not of Octavian against Antony, but Rome against Egypt, Rome against these foreigners. Basically pushing him into an untenable position. So, there's this Cold War between the two, increasing over time. It breaks out into open warfare. 31 BC, two sides meet at the Battle of Actium, just off the western coast of Greece. Egyptian navy against the Roman navy. Octavian's naval forces smash the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. They run back to Egypt as fast as they can. Octavian closely in pursuit. Overwhelming victory here at Actium. Octavian's forces land in Egypt, assemble and start pursuing Mark Antony's forces. And as they start being surrounded, Mark Antony kills himself, falling on a sword. And Cleopatra kills herself, allowing herself to be bitten by a snake to die. So at this point, 31 BC, the age of 32, Octavian is supreme over the Roman world. The civil wars are over. The question of who would control Rome was at an end. That one man who controlled Rome was Octavian Caesar. The Republic is over. The age of the empire begins.